Peace, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are continuing our exploration of the calibration problem with part 2, how prior calibration governs our reasoning. If you haven't watched part 1, I'd encourage you to begin there. In that presentation, we established that human intelligence operates through three irreducible modes of reasoning: deduction, induction, and abduction. Together, they form an interlocking system that allows us to make inferences about reality. When one mode begins to drift, the other to constrain it, allowing the entire system to remain in dynamic equilibrium. To keep our reasoning grounded, three conditions must be satisfied. Our deductive reasoning must remain internally coherent. Our sensory experience must accurately correspond to reality. And our calibration must provide a reliable standard for distinguish truth from error as reality unfolds over time. We also concluded that because human beings cannot ground metaphysical truth with absolute certainty, the rational alternative is neither dogmatism nor skepticism. It is the comparative evaluation of competing worldviews according to shared truth tracking criteria. Today, however, we turn to what is arguably the least understood component of that entire framework: calibration. For most of us, the sequence seems obvious. We observe the world, we reason about what we observe, and then we arrive at our conclusions. But what if that conclusion is backwards? What if we don't first observe and then reason? What if both our observations and our reasoning are already being governed by something much deeper? That is the question we'll explore throughout Part B as we examine how prior calibration quietly governs what we perceive, how we reason, and ultimately the worldview we construct. The central problem in human disagreement is not a lack of reasoning. Everyone reasons. The problem is that our reasoning is a function of how we are calibrated. Human beings do not first observe the world neutrally and only then begin to interpret it. We encounter reality through an already existing lens of assumptions, values, priorities, and governing standards. As the image shows, raw observations, experiences, and sensory inputs pass through that lens. Calibration influences which observations we notice, how much weight we assign to them, and how we interpret their significance. What governs that process? Personal desire, social consensus, inherited assumptions, power and authority, or divine moral truth? These competing standards can take the same underlying observations and organize them into very different representations of reality. Those interpreted observations then acquire the status of facts, and from those facts we draw conclusions and construct our worldview. This is the central insight. Facts are really encountered by a neutral observer. They are encountered by an already calibrated observer. The disagreement therefore does not begin only at the conclusion. It begins much earlier, with the lens governing what we notice, what we prioritize, and what we allow the observation to mean. Most people intuitively believe that human reasoning follows a simple sequence. First, we make neutral observations. Then we interpret those observations through reason. Finally, we arrive at a conclusion. That is the assumed paradigm shown at the top of this slide. It treats observations as objective facts waiting to be discovered, with reasoning acting as a neutral tool that simply analyzes the evidence. But that isn't how human cognition actually works. The process begins much earlier. It begins with calibration. As the lower half of the diagram illustrates, our prior worldview, first principles, values, assumptions, and governing standards shape both what we observe and how we reason about it. In other words, calibration doesn't merely influence our conclusions, it governs the entire process that produces them. Consider two individuals looking at exactly the same event. One is calibrated toward personal autonomy and utilitarian outcomes. The other is calibrated toward divine moral truth. Both are intelligent. Both may reason flawlessly. Both observe the same external reality. Yet, they will often arrive at very different conclusions. Why? Not because one lacks intelligence, not because one ignored the evidence, but because each encounters reality through a different calibration. That calibration determines what each person notices, what each considers important, what each accepts as legitimate evidence, and ultimately what each allows the observations to mean. This is why disagreements so often persist even when everyone has access to the same information. The disagreement didn't begin with the conclusion, it began much earlier with the calibration governing both observation and reasoning. And that brings us to the key insight of this slide. Calibration governs both observation and reasoning. Coherence and correspondence do not evaluate reality directly. They evaluate reality and accept as evidence based on calibration, which means that before we ever begin reasoning, our worldview has already shaped the lens through which reality itself is perceived. Let's pause for a moment and consider one of the oldest and most insightful parables ever told, the story of the blind man and the elephant. Each man encounters the same elephant, but each experiences only one small part of it. One feels the trunk and concludes, it's a snake. Another touches the tusk and insists, no, it's a spear. Another feels the ear and confidently declares, it's a fan. One grasps the leg and says, it's a tree. Another feels the side and concludes, it's a wall. And finally, one holds the tail and says, it's a rope. Now notice something remarkable. Each is reasoning correctly from the observations immediately available to him. Their conclusions are locally coherent. Within the limits of their own experience, each explanation makes perfect sense. They also possess a genuine correspondence with reality. The trunk really is long and flexible. The ear really does resemble a fan. The leg really is tree-like. Each observer has encountered a genuine aspect of the elephant. Yet every one of them is still wrong about the whole. Why? Because each mistakes a fragment of reality for reality itself. This is precisely what happens whenever we reason from partial observations without asking whether our explanation can account for the whole. And this is where the Triple C framework becomes indispensable. Coherence asks whether each explanation is internally consistent. Correspondence asks whether it genuinely reflects something real. But calibration asks an entirely different question. Which explanation best accounts for all of the available evidence simultaneously? Calibration introduces an external governing standard capable of adjudicating between competing explanations. It reveals the global structure that none of the individual observers can perceive within their own limited perspective. Each observer possesses a partial truth, but only the whole corresponds to reality. That brings us to one of the central insights of this entire framework. Partial observation combined with calibration bias inevitably produces a distorted representation of reality. Because truth is not found in isolated fragments, but in the whole. One of the biggest assumptions we make is that facts simply speak for themselves. That if two people examine the same evidence, they'll naturally arrive at the same conclusion. But that is rarely what happens. Facts do not interpret themselves, they require interpretation. And how we interpret them depends on how we are already calibrated. Our worldview, assumptions, values, experiences, and governing standards become the lens through which we encounter reality. That means two intelligent people can observe the same event, examine the same evidence, and yet construct entirely different representations of reality. Notice what's happening in this illustration. On the left is reality itself, integrated, coherent, ordered. On the right is a distorted representation of the same reality, fragmented, incomplete, and shaped by a different lens. The reality hasn't changed, only the calibration has. Once the lens changes, everything downstream changes with it. What we notice, what we ignore, what we consider relevant, how we interpret what we observe, and ultimately what we accept as facts. This is why calibration is so fundamental. When our calibration is wrong, we don't merely make isolated mistakes. We can construct an internal coherent representation of reality that is nevertheless detached from reality itself. That distinction is crucial. People rarely believe falsehood because they are irrational. They believe it because their calibration organizes reality in a way that makes the falsehood appear reasonable. This is not primarily a problem of intelligence. It is a problem of calibration, and it is certainly not a new problem. Human beings have wrestled with it throughout history. The question is, how do we recognize that the world we take for reality may only be a distorted representation of it? The next few examples explore exactly that question. The problem we have been discussing is not a modern discovery. More than 2000 years ago, Plato illustrated it through one of the most influential thought experiments in the history of philosophy, the allegory of the cave. Imagine a group of prisoners who have spent their entire lives chained inside a cave. They cannot turn around. All they can see is the wall before them. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, people walk past carrying various objects. Those objects cast shadows onto the wall. And because the prisoners have never experienced anything else, they naturally conclude this is reality. To them, the shadows are not symbols, they are the world itself. Now, notice something remarkable. The prisoners are not irrational. Given the observations available to them, their conclusions are entirely understandable. Within the cave, their worldview is coherent. It also corresponds to everything they have ever experienced. And yet, it is still false. Why? Because the shadows are not reality. They are only a representation of reality. The prisoners have mistaken the representation for the thing being represented. That distinction is profound. A worldview can appear internally consistent and correspond to lived experience, yet still fail to describe reality itself. Not because the people are unintelligent, but because they are calibrated against appearances rather than against the source that produces those appearances. Plato understood something fundamental about the human condition. Entire societies can mistake consensus for truth simply because everyone inhabits the same cave. And when someone finally escapes and encounters reality itself, the experience is painful. Everything once considered obvious must be questioned. Everything once taken for granted must be re examined. Awakening is rarely comfortable. Now notice how naturally this fits within the Triple C framework. The prisoner's reasoning is coherent. Their experiences genuinely correspond to the shadows they observe. But the governing standard against which they interpret reality is fundamentally misplaced. That is a failure of calibration. And that insight extends far beyond Plato's cave. Any worldview, even one that appears coherent and corresponds to experience, can drift away from reality if it has been calibrated against the wrong standard. This aspect is elegantly captured in the film The Truman Show. Truman is raised inside a massive simulated world, completely convinced that his life is real. Every person he meets, every street he walks, and every experience he has reinforces the same conclusion. Then something begins to happen. Small anomalies appear, the clock behaves strangely, the sun doesn't follow the rules it should, people repeat the same lines, the world itself begins to reveal hidden edges. These glitches cannot be explained by the model Truman has always assumed to be true. At that moment, he faces two very different choices. The easy choice is to remain trapped. He can ignore the anomalies and rationalize them away, telling himself the universe is just acting weirdly today. Every new inconsistency can be explained with another ad hoc assumption, allowing him to preserve the world he already believes in. Or he can choose the harder path. He can acknowledge the glitches, question the model itself, and ask a much deeper question. Which explanation accounts for all of the evidence with the fewest assumptions? The elegant realization is not that one event is unusual, it is that his entire reality is a manufactured set. Suddenly, every anomaly makes sense, not because reality became stranger, but because his model of reality was wrong. That is exactly how calibration operates within the Triple C framework. When our current worldview can no longer explain the evidence without multiplying assumptions, calibration asks us to step back and test the framework itself. Sometimes the most rational explanation is not that reality has become irrational, but that we have mistaken a false representation of reality for reality itself. Plato's allegory is remarkably insightful because it shows that human beings can awaken from deception. But it also leaves us with a deeper question. Once you've escaped one illusion, how do you know you haven't simply entered another? What if the next cave is larger, more convincing, and far more sophisticated than the first? The challenge then is not simply to awaken, it is to remain oriented toward reality. This is where the Triple C framework extends Plato's insight. Coherence and correspondence may persuade us that we have found the truth, but unless our beliefs remain calibrated against the correct standard, we can simply exchange one illusion for another. Escaping one cave is no guarantee that we have reached reality. It may only be the entrance to a new cave with more persuasive shadows. The pursuit of truth is therefore not a single moment of awakening. It is a continual process of testing our assumptions, recalibrating our beliefs, and remaining willing to question even the models that once liberated us. That naturally raises one final question. Is there a standard capable of orienting us toward reality without continually drifting into another cave? The Quran offers a profound answer to that question. Plato showed us that human beings can mistake appearances for reality. The Quran takes that insight one step further. It teaches that false representations of reality are not merely intellectual mistakes. They can appear attractive, persuasive, and even materially successful for long periods of time. That is precisely the pattern described in Surah Al-An'am. When people ignored the truth, they were not immediately confronted with disaster. Instead, the Quran says their hearts became hardened, their actions were made to appear attractive, and the doors of worldly success were opened before them. From the inside, everything looked like confirmation. The system appeared to be working. Prosperity increased. Confidence grew. The prevailing narrative seemed to indicate it. But then comes the turning point. When they rejoiced in what they had been given, we seized them suddenly, and then they were in despair. The Quran's point is profound. Short-term success is not a reliable criterion of truth. A system can flourish for years, even generations, while quietly accumulating the conditions of its own collapse. Reality has a long memory. Eventually, consequences emerge, illusions began to fracture, and the true correspondence between our beliefs and reality is revealed. This introduces something that neither Plato nor the Truman Show fully develops. Truth is tested not only by what appears to work today, but by what remains aligned with reality as time unfolds. In other words, time itself becomes part of the calibration process. A worldview that can only explain the present is incomplete. A superior calibration is one that anticipates where reality is heading before history delivers its verdict. This brings us to the end of Part 2a. In Part 2b, I describe various kinds of calibration schemes and how they are misunderstood for truth based on utilitarian short-term positive outcomes at the expense of long-term consequences that reveal themselves with a temporal lag. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.